Gradually, I became aware of my surroundings again, and my thoughts began to emerge from the fog in my head. The ominous semi-darkness of my basement workshop, lit only by the light from the partially open door, reflected my mood. One of my rackets that I had been working on earlier was still clamped in a vise on the workbench. From the other side of the partition, the sounds of our two youngest children playing in the rec room and the Disney movie they were watching on the VCR reached me. Sitting in my battered old chair, I glanced at the clock on the wall. I had been sitting there for over half an hour now, my thoughts spinning in circles. I didn't move. I didn't look, trying to figure out what I wished I hadn't heard. Sunday evening dinner was finished. My wife Sally cleaned the kitchen and did the dishes, and I went down to my workroom to re-glue some rackets for the upcoming fall racquetball leagues. I'd been an avid player for 7 or 8 years now, playing several mornings a week before going to work as an engineer at GM. I also played in at least one evening league every fall, winter, and spring session. It was a point of pride for me that I got pretty good in that relatively short period of time and always played in the A bracket. I participated in local tournaments several times a year, usually placing first. While playing racquetball, I consistently maintained my weight at about 200 pounds at 6'2". Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, followed me to watch her favorite movie in the game room, followed by a toddler, 4-year-old Allison. Allie was at the age where Jessie couldn't go anywhere without Allie wanting to go with her. Lucky for us, Jessie didn't seem to mind so far. I was dreading the day when she would get older and everything would change. Our son Jason, now 9 years old, was well aware that he was a boy and the oldest and could not be expected to play with his younger sisters. He would likely sit in his room and build or play with his model airplanes and cars. Fortunately, Jason looked like me and many members of the Robinson clan. Brown hair, hazel eyes, a strong chin, and a prominent but not too large nose. Jessie had Sally's red hair and fine facial features. Allie had blonde hair, and although she was still early in life, she seemed to combine both of our features. I finally finished the handles on the 3 rackets I kept in my gym bag, and as I pulled the strings, I thought a couple of them could use some tightening up. Murphy's Law stated that at least once a week, a string might break in the middle of a league game. I looked in on the girls. They were in the middle of Lady and the Tramp, so I decided to head back upstairs. As I climbed the stairs in my stockings and approached the partially open door to the basement, I heard the quiet muttering of Sally talking on the phone. The thought occurred to me that maybe I could sneak up on her and give her a little pawing. I thought about setting the mood for something later in the day, even though we'd already had a morning of mattress cuddling like we usually did on the weekend. Walking over to the door, I peeked through the crack to see where she was. Perfect, I grinned gleefully. Even after 3 kids and 10 years of marriage, Sally was still beautiful. She was about 5 feet 6 inches tall and under 130 pounds, thanks to regular exercise and a proper diet. She looks even better now than when we were married. She was 23 then, and I was only a year older. The kids may have been the reason why we'd slowed down our sex life over the years, but we usually managed to carve out time for ourselves a couple times a week. Slowly opening the door wider, I heard the conversation that was going on over the phone. "The schedule is Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 3, I heard her say. There was a pause as she listened to what the person on the phone was saying. "Yes, I can talk. Phil is in the basement with the girls right now." "Why?" "Yeah, I think so too, Debbie. I've been thinking about it a lot lately." "This coming weekend?" "I don't think we have anything on the calendar. I could probably do it." Now I know. She was talking to her friend and boss, Debbie Bradshaw. Apparently, they were making arrangements for another weekend shopping trip, which happened 3 or 4 times a year. I slowly pushed the door further open and started to step out to make a quick lunge toward the prize that was beckoning me as I suddenly stopped, puzzled by a strange sound. Sally was giggling. "What the hell was that?" Then she giggled again, listening to what Debbie was saying. What surprised the hell out of me was that I couldn't recall Sally ever giggling like that since our honeymoon. Then she lowered her voice and I could make out, "Sure would like to try that thing again before the wart comes off." Suddenly, that remark reminded me of a conversation I'd had in a bar a couple months ago. I started to feel dizzy. I sank down on the basement step and slowly slammed the door behind me. Sally kept laughing and practically whispering into the phone. I could only make out the occasional words, "Last time? I was really on a roll. I know, yeah. Both of you? Tell him I'll see him. Ugh, I can't wait." I stood in the darkness of the stairwell as she began to wind down the conversation. I suddenly didn't want her to be aware of my presence, so I turned, quietly walked down the stairs, and staggered into my workshop. I collapsed into a chair, reflecting on the conversation I remembered. It happened last spring after one of the last Wednesday night games in our racquetball league. Afterward, we went to a bar for a couple beers, which we did about once a month. After an hour or so, it was just me, John Harrison, and Craig Davis. John and Craig were best friends and had joined the Oak Park Y just a couple years before. John liked beer and Craig only liked soft drinks. I learned over time that he was an alcoholic and had quit drinking a few years ago. From what I heard, the only problem with his alcoholism was that he couldn't recover after a couple beers, which apparently annoyed his wife a lot. But he still liked the atmosphere at the bar and joined the crowd every chance he got. Both were married, John had 2 children and Craig had 1. As usual, after discussing the matches, the jokes and conversation turned to women. After a dozen times spent at the bar with these two, I realized they weren't bent on fooling around. And on a couple of occasions, they took an unusual interest in my marriage and my life, to the point of making me uncomfortable. In at least one instance, I left after 1 beer to avoid the subject. That night, Craig was bullying John about his wife, Mary. She was insisting that he have surgery of a very personal nature. I thought he was talking about a vasectomy, and added that Sally was talking about having me do it so she could quit the pills. But so far, we hadn't come to an agreement. Craig continued to smirk as John took on a distressed look on his face. "Oh no, she wants him to remove the wart," said Craig, practically laughing heartily. Looking puzzled, I said, "I guess I'm lost. What are you talking about?" John blushed a little, but explained that he had a regular wart right there. This time I laughed. I'd seen him in the shower, not close enough to notice the wart. He admitted that the wart had grown over the last couple years, and it was starting to scare his wife. John insisted that the wart served an important function. His wife, Mary, insisted that he should have it removed, even if it meant she was losing something in the bargain. It seemed to me that John was not so much objecting to his wife losing money as he was objecting to her losing the advantage he had in pursuing other women. Apparently, his wart was often a topic of discussion and aroused a certain curiosity when he tried to get other women into bed besides his wife. It was around this time that I decided that this shit was getting too deep for me and decided to hit the road. Now I was sitting in the dark thinking about that conversation. I just couldn't believe that Sally could be involved in what her phone call had hinted at. Sally knew that John and Craig were the ones I played racquetball with. I had talked about them several times before, and their names were usually on the schedule of matches I kept with our calendar. But as far as I knew, they had never met. But the dots kept connecting themselves, no matter how much I tried to deny it. I got the feeling that I was in the dark, and I felt a sweat break out on me. I just couldn't believe that Sally could have done such a thing, and I desperately hoped there was some plausible explanation. And whatever was going on, Debbie was obviously in on it too. Sally's boss, Debbie Bradshaw, had become assistant manager of the store where Sally worked about 5 years ago. She was transferred from corporate headquarters outside Detroit. She had previously worked at the same store right out of college and then moved to the big city to get her management training. Debbie was married to Josh, a financial controller whom she met while working in Detroit. Sally told me that Josh was her second husband. Sally and Debbie were about the same age and became friends when Sally was pregnant with Allie. At the same time, Debbie was pregnant with daughter Shannon, their first and so far only child. Both babies were born within a month of each other, which brought Debbie and Sally even closer together. We socialized with Debbie and Josh a few times over the years, usually at some event related to Debbie and Sally's work. We were not in the same social circles and were perhaps a notch below them financially. Debbie was a smart, beautiful, green-eyed blonde. But it always seemed to me that she should be the center of attention. Josh seemed like a nice enough guy, but it always seemed to me that his main focus was his work. John and Craig joined the Y's Racquetball League about 2 years ago. John owned a construction business, and Craig was the managing partner of a residential construction company. The senior partner was his father-in-law. We were all about the same age, married and had families, so we had a lot in common. But oddly enough, we only socialized during a racquetball game or when we stopped in for a couple beers afterward. Our families never met. As is often the case when you start socializing with new people, you find that you have mutual friends and acquaintances. One day when I mentioned the store where Sally worked, John said he had an acquaintance who also worked there. It turned out to be Debbie Bradshaw. Debbie graduated from the same high school as John and Craig, but a year later than them. He said they see each other a couple times a year. The shopping trip started about 2 years ago when our youngest Allie was going through the terrible twos. For a few months, Sally was especially bad with Allie. Jessie went to daycare, so she was home half the day too. Trying to take care of 3 kids, a house, and a job a couple days a week was knocking her out. I wasn't much help at the time, as I was working extra hours each week on a project assigned to me. It got to the point that one night when everyone had gone to bed, she collapsed on the couch and started sobbing with frustration and exhaustion. I picked her up in my arms and just held her until she finally calmed down. After talking about the situation, she complained that if she could just get a break from it once in a while, she would be relieved. I was so upset that I couldn't be around as often as I should have been that I offered to be fully responsible for the kids on her next day off if she wanted some time off. She tearfully thanked me and said she would think about it. A couple weeks later, Sally said that she had talked to Debbie about needing to get away from the kids. Debbie suggested that they go shopping together and visit some expensive shopping centers in the suburbs of Detroit. Debbie was sure her husband wouldn't mind. Despite my reservations about letting her go to an expensive mall with a credit card, I agreed. So, on my next free weekend, Sally and Debbie left Saturday morning for Detroit. On the way, they stopped for breakfast and then stopped at one of the malls. After lunch, they checked into a motel, had dinner, and went to a movie. Before leaving, I insisted that she call me right after checking in and give me the phone number and room number where she was staying, which she did. The next day, they checked out of the hotel, had lunch, and went to another mall before returning home around 5 o'clock in the evening. Sally was so grateful for the trip that she hugged and kissed me as soon as she walked in the door and talked at length about the stores and restaurants. She didn't go on a crazy shopping spree, but bought a few nice things for herself and the kids. I was happy for her. Plus, the kids were very good to me, so I had no complaints. That was over 2 years ago. After that weekend, shopping trips somehow became a regular occurrence on their own. Every 3 or 4 months, the two of them would leave on Saturday morning and return late Sunday night. I didn't mind that much. I enjoyed spending time alone with the kids, and it seemed to please Sally. I tried to remember if anything had changed since these trips started. I remembered that the second time she came back, she was in a very different state of mind than she had been after the first trip. For some reason, she seemed sullen, sad, and perhaps a little nervous. I told her this on Sunday night and asked her what was the matter. She replied that it was nothing, but that she had gotten her period, and I knew she sometimes had blue discharge. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that after that first time, we never made love the night she came back or for a few days after that. But we always did it a few days before she left. And when the trips continued, in the week leading up to one of them, Sally was always on the rebound, almost giddy. I hadn't given it much thought before, but now I wondered. About this time, I heard Sally calling to me from the top of the stairs. "Phil, it's bath time for the girls. Can you send them upstairs?" I just sat there trying to gather my thoughts. "Phil? Phil? Can you hear me?" I got up from my chair, walked to the foot of the stairs, and called out to her sourly, "Yes, I heard you. I'll get them." I entered the restroom and after some argument escorted the kids out. After they climbed the stairs, I wandered around the room picking up and putting things away. Mostly to kill time. I needed to gather my thoughts and not let the emotions raging inside me show. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer and went back upstairs. Sally was looking through a cookbook in the kitchen when I walked through the door. She threw her head back, looked me in the eye, smiled, and said, "Is something wrong, honey? Did you get the impression?" Feeling awkward, I mumbled something about finding a crack on one of my favorite rackets. But I kept looking into her eyes, trying to see anything that might confirm my suspicions. But there was nothing to see. She was just Sally, the woman I loved. She laughed and kissed me again. "Debbie called while you were downstairs. She wanted to know if we could go shopping at the end of next week." At those words, her eyes narrowed, and it was as if a veil had fallen over them. When I stared at her, she blinked and looked away from my face. I knew immediately that she was hiding something, and I thought, how long has this been going on? In desperation, I tried to think of a way to postpone this trip until I could think of something. Anything. "Don't we have something planned for next weekend?" I said unconvincingly. "There's nothing on the calendar," she replied. "I think there's a VFW event on Saturday night and I thought we should attend," I said slowly. Sally pulled away from me and looked at me appraisingly. "Phil, you know I don't like going to these events. I don't care if Dad goes too. All you guys do is talk about army stuff and drink too much. It bores me to tears, so if you want to go, just get a babysitter while I'm gone. Then why don't we do something with the kids this weekend? Cedar Point will be open for a few more weeks before it closes for the season, and we haven't taken Allie with us once yet. She's old enough to enjoy it, said I, grasping at straws. Sally frowned and her face reddened, as it does on the rare occasions when she gets really angry. We just took the kids to Mackinac Island over Labor Day weekend. That was only a couple weeks ago. What's gotten into you, Phil? You've never objected to me shopping before? A little annoyed, I said with a stone face. Never mind, I just thought we could do something together. You and Debbie are having a good time. I'm going to go upstairs and make sure the kids go to bed. I turned and headed up the stairs toward the bedrooms. Halfway down, I looked back down and saw Sally looking at me strangely. For the rest of the evening, I managed to avoid any serious conversation with her. Like most work nights, I got into bed before Sally and tried to sleep. After a while, I heard her enter the house and head into the bathroom to change into her pajamas. She slid into bed and snuggled up against my back. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, Phil. I continued to breathe shallowly and regularly and pretended to be asleep. Eventually, she gave up and rolled away from me. I could tell by her breathing when she finally fell asleep. I rolled over onto my back and stared at the ceiling, trying to sort out my thoughts. I went back in time, reflecting on my life and how I got to this point. I grew up less than 20 miles from where we lived now. A normal middle-class family, mom, dad, me, and my older sister. The most interesting thing about my childhood was my best friend Jason, or Jace as everyone used to call him. His family lived at one end of the block and we lived at the other. We met around 4th grade and had been inseparable ever since. If he wasn't at our house, I was at his. Not a week went by that one of us didn't spend at least one night at the other's house. He was Mr. Personality, always joking, always laughing, rarely taking anything seriously, and always making friends wherever he went. I, on the other hand, was more quiet and thoughtful. We complemented each other. As we grew up, we played sports together, started paying attention to girls together, and dated often. Although neither of us had a serious relationship with one girl, we both managed to lose our virginity in the last few months before prom. As students, we both weren't outstanding, but I usually got better grades than Jace. One thing I discovered in high school that I enjoyed was drafting. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had taken all the drafting courses and was seriously considering becoming an engineer of some sort. After high school, I decided to go to a local junior college that had an engineering technology program. It was relatively inexpensive and close enough to live at home and commute to work. Jace didn't know what he wanted to do, but he enrolled in general education courses. The biggest advantage was that we got a deferment from the military draft. At the end of my freshman year, I had a big blunder. Jace and I were at a college party on Saturday night, and I got pulled over on the way home. I failed the breathalyzer and spent the night in the county jail. Dad and Mom bailed me out the next morning and were justifiably pissed. After all was said and done, I spent all my savings to pay fines, court fees, and lost my driver's license for a year. For the rest of the semester, I rode my moped around giving Jace rides. Eventually, I decided, screw it. Being broke without a driver's license gave me no incentive to go to school the next year. I decided to roll the dice and enlist in the Army. I figured that with my drafting training, I could get a job as an engineer and avoid Vietnam. At least that's what the recruiter told me. Of course he lied. When I told Jace about my plans, he immediately decided to join me. The recruiter said we could enlist as buddies and be guaranteed to train together. So off we went. Basic training was difficult but tolerable. Midway through training, we went through a battery of aptitude tests to determine what kind of work we were suited for. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that we would best serve the green machine as fire control specialists. The job was to operate what the Army called an FDC computer, but it was actually an advanced calculator that calculated distances, azimuths, and the number of explosive charges to use to hit an artillery shell. So after basic service, we were sent to Fort Sill to learn a new trade. Sill was not a very pleasant place, but being with Jace, we were able to have some fun. But that was nothing compared to the next prize we got. A couple weeks before graduation, orders came to go to Vietnam. After 15 days of vacation, visiting family, drinking beer with old buddies, and chasing after a couple of our old girlfriends, we took the long flight to I Corps, Republic of Vietnam. After some deliberation with the personnel officers, we both managed to get assigned to Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery Brigade. It was November 1969, and Nixon had already begun to reduce troop levels as the strategy of handing the war over to the South Vietnamese gained momentum. What a joke that was. For the first 5 or 6 months, we didn't see much combat. We flew a lot of sorties from fire support bases throughout I Corps, but only participated in raids a couple times. Up to this point, the highlight of our tour was a vacation in Bangkok, Thailand. After 15 days spent in the company of whores and booze, Jace and I returned to our unit exhausted, hoping to get some rest. The news that our unit had been attached to the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Corps during our absence was not particularly exciting. But a couple days later, when our battery was airlifted to a desolate hill in the middle of the deepest, darkest bush I'd ever seen since arriving in Vietnam, I got a bad feeling. 4 months later, I came home on a stretcher. Jace came home in a body bag. I was very depressed, both physically and mentally, by the trauma I had suffered. I spent a few weeks in the hospital and a couple of months in a rehab center. I also spent some time with a psychiatrist trying to make sense of everything that had happened. After I was declared almost fit for duty again, I was sent back to Fort Sill to the training brigade as an assistant instructor. I didn't want to talk to anyone else, so I enrolled in courses at the local college and spent my off-duty hours immersed in writing assignments. After serving there for a year, I applied for early release so I could go back to school. As Vietnam was ending, the Army was increasing in numbers. I applied and was accepted into an engineering training program at the university closest to home. The Army approved my request and I was released 5 months early, having served 2 years and 7 months. I moved back in with my mom and dad and applied for veterans benefits. Living at home, my needs were small. I had most of my money set aside while still serving in Vietnam. And my education benefits and income from my part-time job covered all my expenses. Looking back, I was a typical, or perhaps stereotypical, shell-shocked, confused Vietnam veteran. Society's reaction to the war and those involved, combined with my injuries and what I saw and did, turned me into a bitter, introverted recluse. I let my hair down and grew a beard. Most of the time, I wore a hooded sweatshirt or an old, worn army field jacket. Ratty jeans and worn sneakers completed my ensemble. I walked to school, to work, and home. I know Mom, Dad, and my sister Terry were worried about me. But I just didn't feel socially active anymore. I still saw a therapist about once a month, but it didn't help me much. About once a week, I would visit Jace's parents and we would talk about him and the good times we had together. They seemed to enjoy it, and it was the least I could do for them. One afternoon, I was sitting in the study hall of the International Center on campus. A few days a week, I had a couple hours between classes, and I usually spent that time studying or reading. As I tried to ignore the noise of the crowd around me, a voice broke my concentration. "Mind if I sit here?" I glanced at the man standing on the other side of the table and stunned. Long red hair with the perfect pale complexion that only a true redhead could achieve. Curious brown eyes stared into mine, waiting patiently for an answer. I licked my lips nervously, looking at her perfectly shaped red lips and wondering what they would be like on mine. I was immersed in those thoughts when she repeated, "Do you mind if I sit here?" My tongue lisped and I managed to mutter, "No, go ahead." As she put her books down and pulled out a chair to sit, I studied her with an edge of my eye. She was probably 7 or 8 inches shorter than I was, weighed about 20, and was very well built. For the next half hour, she was immersed in her books while I pretended to be glued to mine. From time to time, I glanced at her and marveled at her looks. About the 5th or 6th time, I looked up and saw that she was looking at me. She pointed to my field jacket and somewhat uncertainly said, "Are you a veteran?" I nodded affirmatively and then she asked, "Vietnam?" I flinched when she said that, as the answer was often not a nice one. But I just said, "Yes," and left it at that. A few minutes later, she happily said, "My dad is a veteran. He served in the Korean War. He was a Marine." I relaxed a little and thought that maybe it wasn't so bad. Then she said, "He was even wounded." She said it as if it was about nothing. Civilians, I thought with disgust. But I just nodded and explained to her that I had been in the Army for almost 3 years, but avoided mentioning Vietnam. We started talking and talked until she said it was time for her to go to class. She gathered her books, said goodbye, and walked out the door. I was sorry to see her go. She was the first woman I really talked to after coming home. A couple days later, I was sitting in almost the same spot when I heard a familiar voice say, "Hey, mind if I sit here?" This time I responded a little more coherently than the first time. I tried to immerse myself in the book, but she started talking to me like we were best friends. After a while, she paused and, blushing slightly, said, "Did I just realize that I'm babbling away and I don't even know your name?" A little embarrassed, I held out my hand and said, "It's Phil Robinson." She laughed and replied, "Sally Baxter. Nice to meet you." It turned out that we both had long breaks between classes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Over the next few weeks, we met for almost the entire break. I heard almost her entire life story about her mom, dad, older sisters, friends, career, and college plans. In addition to being beautiful, she was outgoing, sociable, and disposable. Her personality reminded me a lot of Jace. I told her about my family and classes, but not much else. I deflected any questions about the Army. Frankly, I preferred to listen to her. She could read to me from the phone book and I would still listen. I was completely fascinated by her. Somehow she had managed to captivate me, to get me interested in something other than school again. After the second visit, I started shaving in the morning for the first time in weeks. After the third or fourth time, I actually went and got a haircut and started dressing less sloppily. My mom immediately noticed the change in me and started questioning me. I honestly admitted that I had met someone I was interested in. She teased me a little, but it was obvious that she was happy about it. A few weeks after we met, I plucked up the courage to ask her out. She seemed pleased and said yes right away. Like me, she drove from home to attend classes. After she agreed to have me pick her up Friday night, she said with a laugh, "Keep in mind, my dad can sometimes be hard on guys who ask me out. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Sally, I think that for the privilege of dating you, the least I can do is put up with your dad for a few minutes. Or a lifetime," I thought to myself. She blushed and said, Oh, what a flatterer." I discovered that she blushes easily. Friday night, I knocked on her door and was answered by a woman with a warm smile. Before I could say anything, she said, "You must be Phil. We've been expecting you. Please come in." She took my hand and pulled me inside. As she did so, she called over her shoulder, "Jack, Sally's beau is here." She turned to me and said in a kind voice, "Don't worry about Sally's father. He's really not as bad as she thinks he is. By the way, my name is Emily." And she shook the hand she was still holding. I was pondering how to respond to all this when her father appeared from around the corner of the kitchen. He was a big guy about my height, but outweighed my 80-plus pounds. Not fat, but stout. "I'm Jack," he said in a deep voice, holding out his hand and looking at me intently. "Phil Robinson," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Come on into the family room. We can talk for a few minutes while Sally finishes her work." The three of us walked through the kitchen into a cozy wood-paneled room with a TV in one corner and a couch and a couple of soft armchairs arranged around it. One side of the room was occupied by a fireplace with a hearth and mantel that stretched along the entire wall. On one side of the fireplace stood a triangular wooden box with a folded American flag. On the other side of the mantel was a wooden box with a glass front that I had seen in several stores during my time in the Army. They were used to display military memorabilia, patches, ribbons, and medals. Between them on a pedestal was an M1 Garand rifle. With its polished buttstock and saddle-style leather harness, it looked very businesslike. Above the rifle hung a framed Marine Corps flag. It all looked very intimidating. Jack saw me looking at the fireplace and proudly said, "I was a Marine in Korea. I would have stayed, but I was wounded in the breakout from Pusan and then wounded again in the retreat from Chosin Reservoir. After that, I couldn't get a physical examination." I nodded and said, "Yeah, Sally mentioned that. Tough times." "Sally said you were a Vietnam veteran?" asked Jack as the three of us sat down at the table. "I was there for a while," said I awkwardly. "What did you do there?" "I was a fire control specialist in an artillery battery, 1555, said I. He nodded in agreement. 155 are the workhorses of artillery. "What part of Vietnam did you serve in?" Emily cut in, "You'll have to forgive Jack. He's kind of a military history buff. He keeps up with everything to do with the war." "Of course, I understand. Our battery was all over I Corps. Jack looked at me like he couldn't tell if I was a real soldier like him or some bastard from the rear echelon. But Marines never thought much of soldiers. I Corps, huh? This was Marine country. Well, by the time I got there, the Marines were mostly out. Jack snorted, Yeah, Vietnamization. That's a great term for take this country. It's yours. Jack, it's not over, Emily said. It's over except for the screaming. Just wait and see, he insisted, looking at her. I breathed a sigh of relief as that's when Sally walked in. It was obvious that this conversation could go on forever, and the last thing I wanted to do was talk about Vietnam. We talked for a few minutes about school and what we were going to do that evening, and then said goodbye and left. That night, we went out to dinner and a movie. I can't say I remember much about it as I was completely absorbed in our conversation. In the movie theater, we held hands and sat close, almost touching each other's heads. After the movie, neither of us wanted to end the night, so we stopped by the bar for a drink. I ended up walking her to the door a few minutes before she told her parents she was coming home. I stood in an awkward pose, really wanting to touch her, to kiss her, but at the same time afraid of ruining the evening, when she snatched the idea out of my hands. She reached up, wrapped her arms around my neck, and, almost touching my nose, looked into my eyes and whispered, Thank you, Phil, for a wonderful evening. Time stood still as I looked into her deep brown eyes. I swear I could look into her soul. Everything she was and everything she would ever become was completely open to me. In that moment, I realized I had fallen in love with her. I put my hands on her waist and kissed her gently. From that day on, at least a couple times a week, we cuddled like this. She put her arms around my neck, I held her tightly, and we looked into each other's eyes, hiding nothing. Reluctantly, she pulled away from me and went into the house. The next day I called her and we talked on the phone for an hour. We set up another date for the middle of the week, and just like that, we became exclusive. A few weeks later, when I told her I had gotten a motel room for the following Saturday, she blushed, as she often did, but then just smiled and nodded. The evening was everything I could have dreamed of. There were a few awkward moments when she saw the scars that Vietnam had left on me, but I assured her that the doctors had repaired everything and I felt fine. I said quietly in her ear, Sally, I love you. You probably don't want to hear it, but I can't help it. Sally pulled back her face and looked down at me. I could see tears glistening in her eyes and her lips curved in a smile. I love you too, Phil. I never knew it could be like this. I want to lie like this forever. I laughed in relief and kissed the tip of her nose. I don't know about that, but I sure know I want to do it again and again and again. This time she laughed and then moaned as I, still hard, entered her. God, Phil, everything you want, everything? For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at peace with the world. That life was getting better. That I had a future with someone I loved and who loved me back. By the time we left the motel, exhausted, in the wee hours of the morning, we knew we wanted to be together for the rest of our lives. That night we talked about everything. About marriage, children, where we wanted to live, what we wanted to do with our lives. Although Sally was a year younger than me, she was a year ahead of me in school. She was graduating at the end of this spring, and I was graduating a year later. We decided that after graduation, Sally would go to work and we would wait and get married right after I graduated. In the meantime, I would rent an apartment so we could be together until then. A week later, I took Sally home to introduce her to my folks. My dad, Dave, worked as a toolmaker at GM. My mom, Donna, had been working as a part-time teacher's aide since my sister and I moved to middle school. Sally and my folks took an instant liking to each other. My mom later said they loved Sally not only for herself, but for the way she brought me out of my shell. And I was changed. I was happy. I couldn't stop smiling most of the time. I was so bad that the next time I saw my therapist, he kicked me out of his office and told me not to come back. Sally's father and I continued to have a wary relationship. I'm sure he was concerned about the man who had knocked his youngest daughter down. And the fact that we were close didn't help matters. The look on his face when we talked about living together before marriage was frightening. That changed a few months later when Jack and Emily invited us over for dinner. Jack and I secluded ourselves in the living room, while Sally and her mother stayed in the kitchen putting away food and talking. After a few minutes of small talk on the usual topics, Jack hesitated for a moment and then said, Sally told me that you have some serious scars from your time in Vietnam. She asked me what might have caused them. I looked away, feeling uncomfortable for some reason. Yeah, but it's not something I like to talk about, especially with her. Jack smiled and said, I know what you mean. Civilians usually don't. After a moment, he said, Phil, when you and I met, I was under the impression that you didn't see much going on over there. Reluctantly, I replied, Not really. Not until the last fire base I was at. After a moment's silence, he asked, Which base exactly? I hesitated again. Ripcord. Jack's eyes suddenly widened. Ripcord? You were on Ripcord? I nodded. In the summer of 70? He asked with some tension. I nodded again. I was somewhat surprised that he had even heard of Ripcord. The Army had done its best to minimize any news of that battle because of the high number of casualties we had suffered. This was not difficult to do since President Nixon's tour of Cambodia was taking place at the same time. At this point, Sally and her mom returned to the den, and we started talking about school and Sally's upcoming graduation. Jack and I never talked about it again, but from that moment on, Jack treated me like the son he never had. After that, things began to happen very quickly. Sally graduated from high school with honors. She got a well-paying job as an assistant buyer at a retail store nearby. She spent as much time with me as she could in my apartment. But her mom and dad had it in their heads that she should move in with me permanently. I graduated on time and got a job at General Motors as a draftsman before I even got my degree. 2 months later, we were married. Since we were both working, we were able to afford a small house on a large enough lot to annex if the need arose. A year later, our son Jason was born. Named after my best friend, he was a miracle. 2 years later, we had Jesse. By then, we thought it was over. But after some hesitation, we gave birth to Allison 3 years after Jesse. The birth of our son was special, but it was the girls who wrapped their little fingers around me. Sally cut back part-time and moved into retail when Jason was born. She wanted to work at least part-time between having kids and eventually go back to full-time when all the kids went to school. Right now, her work hours fluctuated between 12 and 20 hours a week. That was fine with her because she was eligible for a large employee discount, and keeping the kids clothed was expensive. Since I started working, my work has steadily evolved. In the beginning, I was translating part designs into programs to create numerical control ribbons for automated manufacturing. By the time Allie was born, we were watching the first computer-aided design systems begin to be developed, and the company selected me to be part of a group to be trained on the very first implementation. Life was good. Money was plentiful, and we could afford 2 cars and a modest but nice house. In between having children, we added a bedroom, bathroom, and recreation room. We had 3 beautiful and healthy children. We did many things together as a family. Every year we took at least one family vacation with the 5 of us, and twice a year Sally and I sent the kids to their grandparents for a long weekend somewhere just for us. I always thought our marriage was strong, and we weren't shy about declaring our love for each other. We hugged, held hands, and touched each other often. I would look at her and other guys' wives and think how lucky I was, and I often told her so. I had always thought we were all just as in love now, and just as fervently in love with each other as we were 10 years ago. Now I wasn't so sure. I could feel my life turning to shit. Sleep eluded me most of the night, and I probably only managed to get a couple hours of sleep. The next morning, I didn't go to the Y and staggered into the office, shut the door, and stared at the wall. I knew I had to come up with a plan of action. I had to somehow figure out what was going on. I could ask Sally directly what was going on. As far as I knew, she had never lied to me before. But if she was already hiding something, would she tell me the truth now? And how would I find out? I knew what I overheard. I knew what I saw in her eyes. I started doodling on my notepad and making notes on where to go next. What steps to take to figure out what was going on? But when it came to figuring out what I would do if things turned out to be the worst-case scenario, I was lost. I loved Sally. I loved my children. The thought of being without them scared the hell out of me. But even scarier was the thought that maybe Sally didn't really love me. For the next few days, I was like a zombie at work and at home. I couldn't think about anything else. Sally didn't even notice until Jace said something about my dad acting out. I just chalked it up to having a work project on my mind. Tuesday, I got back into my usual routine and went to play racquetball before work as usual. John was there, and of course, Craig. The thought occurred to me that I had never seen John without Craig and vice versa. I realized that if John was involved in something, so was Craig. When I entered the locker room, they were standing at the end of one of the aisles, changing clothes and talking quietly to each other. When they looked up and saw me, John laughed and Craig started smirking as if he was the only one in on the joke. I realized now that the smirk was a normal expression on his face. I tensed up and started to get angry. For the first time, I began to think of these two as my adversaries. John was an inch taller and maybe 10 pounds heavier than me. Craig was a little shorter in stature and stocky. I usually beat them at racquetball, mostly because I'd been doing it longer and was in better shape. I controlled myself, and the six of us played a few pickup games. John and Craig were cordial, and we exchanged some small talk, after which we all cleaned up and went to work. On Wednesday, I decided to check on John and Craig's whereabouts on Saturday. I called John at home from work and talked to his wife. I told her that I was one of the guys in his racquetball league and was calling to see if John could play on Saturday. She replied that as far as she knew, he was going to a business conference in Detroit in the afternoon and would be back on Sunday. My heart throbbed when I heard this. On a hunch, I called Craig's house and got the same answer from his wife. Slowly hanging up the phone, I sat down and stared out the window. It was true, it had to be true. The four of them had hooked up down there. But the question remained, how far did it go? It didn't matter, but it was too far. I was angry. A voice rang in my head. Do something! Friday night after work, I stopped by my mom and dad's house. Dad had retired last year, and they were planning to spend the winter in Florida. In the meantime, they were spending a lot of time renovating the house, getting it ready to sell in case they found something they liked there. They also liked to take their grandchildren with them every chance they got. I told them I needed to talk to them, and we sat at the kitchen table with iced tea while I tried to figure out how to tell them. Finally, I sighed and said, I don't know how to say it, so I'll just say it. I think Sally is cheating on me. As soon as I said that, tears streamed down my face and I practically sobbed. It was the first time I'd ever said the unthinkable out loud. Mom and Dad recoiled in shock. No, this can't be happening. Not Sally. Sally wouldn't do that to you. She couldn't do that to you, whispered Mom. Son, why do you think that? Said Dad quietly. I recounted everything I had overheard and what I had learned. Mom sat and cried quietly, shaking her head. Dad reached out and pulled her to him and hugged her tightly. What do you want from us, Phil? Asked Dad. I need to know for sure. I have to be where they'll be tomorrow night. I know it's a lot to ask, but could you pick up the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I pleaded. Dad nodded. Sure, Phil. But I pray to God this is all a misunderstanding. I nodded. Yeah, me too. But it's hard to see how it could be. Shaking my head, I got up and left. When I got home, Sally, bouncing around, was finishing dinner. When I walked into the kitchen, she turned around, put her arms around my neck, and kissed me. The kids are in the break room. Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes, she said cheerfully. I could tell her thoughts were already preoccupied with the weekend. She was practically flying, like she was on speed or something. As I thought about it, it also occurred to me that we hadn't had anything since the previous Saturday. We'd missed our usual midweek meeting, probably because I'd been in a terrible mood all week and had taken sleeping pills a couple times to get through the night. But Sally never brought it up either. I wondered how she would feel about the idea. I hesitantly said, Honey, I just realized that we haven't made love since last weekend. And you won't be home this weekend? How about we put the kids to bed early and make some time for ourselves tonight? Sally took her hands off my neck and stepped back a little. I saw the veil fall over her eyes again and her smile became forced. Phil, I'd love to. But I got my period a little early today, she said hesitantly. I replied inexpressively, Oh? Sure, I understand. She raised her hand, stroked my cheek, and said seriously, As soon as your period is over, I'll explain everything to you, I swear. Okay? All I could do was not break free from her arms. Yeah, then it's a date, muttered I. She hugged me and happily went back to making dinner. I turned and slowly walked up the stairs to change. While Sally was on the pill, her periods were regular like clockwork. That was clear to me now. She was saving herself for tomorrow's date. If I didn't know what to do before, I did now. The anger was getting stronger and the voice saying, do something, was getting louder. Making it through the entire dinner without showing all the emotions I was feeling was difficult. The kids were chattering away as usual, and Sally didn't notice anything. Could this be the last time we sat down to dinner as a family? I turned away as the thought brought tears to my eyes. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The older children cleaned their rooms after breakfast. Allie pretended to help. When they were done, they were able to watch cartoons. I fiddled around in the garage until it was time for Sally to leave. Then I went back into the house. Sally was just coming down the stairs with her suitcase and yelling at the kids to behave while she was gone. Allie was standing right behind her and yelling, "Buy me something, Mommy! Buy me something!" Sally stopped at the foot of the stairs, dropped her suitcase, picked Allie up in her arms, and gave her a hug and a kiss. "I will, sweetie. Be a good girl for Daddy." Sally handed Allie to me and kissed her and said, "I have to go. I have to pick Debbie up in 20 minutes. I nodded. "Don't forget to call me as soon as you get to the hotel." "Which one?" She laughed and said, "I always do that. It's the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills. Bye." And she walked out the door. I stood on the porch, holding Allie in my arms, and watched her drive away without looking back. As soon as she was out of sight, I slowly walked back into the house and yelled to Jace and Jesse. I had at least 2 hours before Sally would call to let me know she had gotten there safely. More than enough time to do what I had to do. The two of them walked down the stairs, chatting and asking me what I wanted. I told them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's house for the night, so they needed to pack a bag with pajamas, a change of clothes, and their favorite toys. With a bit of fussing and no answers to the inevitable questions, I made them turn around and go back to their rooms. I helped Allie gather her things and led everyone out of the house and into the car. Mom and Dad were waiting at the door when we pulled up. I unloaded all my stuff and checked into the house. As I headed for the exit, Dad threw me a concerned look. "Good luck, Phil." "I hope you're wrong." I sighed. "I know, Dad, me too." "Thanks for doing this." "I'll call you in the morning." I headed home through the airport. I stopped at Avis and switched cars. I didn't want my car to be recognized where I was headed. A couple hours later, I was still sitting in the kitchen looking at the clock. The events of the week were replaying in my head with repetitive slowness. When the phone finally rang after 1 o'clock, I stared at it stupidly, but then I came to my senses and picked it up. "Is that you, Phil?" I heard Sally's voice say. "Yeah, it's me." "You didn't even say hello. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, just fine." "Is everything okay with you?" I said with a bit of sarcasm. "I don't know what you mean by all sets, but we made it okay. We stopped for lunch on the way. We're staying in room 168, number 555-645-0168. We made small talk for a few minutes. Then she said, "Debbie is waving at me. I have to go. We are spending the afternoon at the Meadowbrook Village Shopping Center. I'll see you tomorrow." And the phone clicked as she hung up without waiting for me to say goodbye. I thought, she didn't even say she loved you. And this morning when she left, she didn't say it either. I dialed the Red Roof Inn I'd found earlier and asked for a reservation. I asked if Sally Robinson had checked in. They replied that she was, and that I would be connected to her room. I said no, that would not be necessary. I would meet her later. I hung up and dialed the number again. This time I asked if John Harrison was registered. I was answered that yes, but he hadn't registered yet. I said I would call back later and hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, trying to suppress the anger that was threatening to turn into a murderous frenzy. It was a frightening feeling that I hadn't experienced in years. I stood up, walked slowly into the workshop, and unlocked the door of the gun cabinet. I stood there looking at Dad's old 16-gauge double-barreled shotgun, a 36-inch Winchester Model 73 rifle, and an old machine gun handle left over from when I was a kid. Dad gave me his old rifle when he and Mom planned to move before he retired last year. I bought a Winchester back in high school when I went deer hunting for a couple years. After Vietnam, I couldn't bear the thought of hunting again. I stood there, immersed in contemplation. I knew that if I took my gun with me, I might never see my children again. Bending over, I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out an old, beat-up shoebox littered in the corner. I carried the box upstairs and tossed it on the kitchen table. I rummaged through the pile of stuff until I found what I was looking for. I pulled the Ka-Bar sea knife I'd bought in Bangkok out of its sheath and felt the point it was still sharp. Most of the hilt was stained a dark, rusty color. I shoved it back in, bent over, pulled up my pant leg, strapped the knife to my calf, and covered it up. I gathered a few things I might need. Driving gloves, a water bottle, a couple candy bars. It was already 2 o'clock when I got behind the wheel of the car to start the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I pulled into the parking lot of the Red Roof Inn and drove slowly along the building until I pulled up to room 168. I didn't see Sally's car, so I parked a couple rows away from the room, turned the car off, and waited. I didn't feel like it, but I kept thinking and reminiscing about Sally and the kids. It was already 5 o'clock when a new red pickup truck I recognized pulled into the parking lot right in front of Sally's room. John and Craig got out of the car. They looked quite happy, laughing and talking. They pulled a couple suitcases and a refrigerator out of the trunk and went into the next room. After about 45 minutes, they came out and got back in the truck. I followed them for a few miles until they turned into the parking lot of a bar called Tupper's Pub. I stopped on the street and watched them go inside. I then slowly drove around the parking lot and almost immediately spotted Sally's car. I parked on the street so I could see both the front door and John's red pickup. I wondered if I should go inside, but the bar seemed small and I was afraid of being noticed. I sat and listened to old country music and an endless string of She Made Me Wrong songs. It suited my mood. It was already 9 o'clock when the four of them finally left the bar, laughing and joking and holding hands. Instead of trying to follow them, I decided to outrun them and head back to the hotel. At this time of day, I didn't think they were going anywhere else. Plus, by parking where I was, I could easily get on the road before them. I parked in front of their license plate with the windows down about 10 minutes before Sally's pickup and car pulled into the parking lot. The four of them got out of the car and stood in front of room 1, talking. I was close enough to see them in the lantern light above the door, but far enough away that I couldn't hear what they were talking about except for occasional bursts of laughter. They seemed to be arguing good-naturedly about something. After a few minutes, John swung a coin out of his pocket, tossed it in the air, and caught it, then held his hand out in front of everyone to show which side was up. Some of the onlookers nodded approvingly, and Craig pulled an unresisting Sally to him and kissed her soundly. Smiling, Debbie grabbed John's hand and pulled him into the other room. Holding hands, the two couples laughingly went to different rooms, pointing and waving at each other. I sat stunned. Who had done who? What kind of game was this? As my mind wrestled with my anguish, with the realization of what was probably going on in room 168, the voice I had heard all week in the back of my mind began to escalate to a scream. Do something! Anything! Do what? It was obvious this wasn't the first time. They were too good with each other. I couldn't undo what Sally had already done. 10 years. 10 years of marriage and starting a family. She'd ruined it all, and me. What good was that going to do now? I thought I knew the answer to that question. At least I'll sleep better knowing I tried to do that. Then John came out of Debbie's room, dressed only in boxer shorts and a t-shirt. He had a beer in his hands. I glanced at my watch and suddenly realized I'd been staring at their door for over an hour. John looked around the building from head to toe to make sure no one could see him, then walked over to Sally's room and knocked on the door twice. A couple minutes later, Craig came out wearing jeans, no shirt or shoes. He closed the door behind him. They stood talking for a few minutes while John sipped his beer. Then they high-fived each other, and this time John went to Sally's room and Craig went to Debbie's room. Suddenly it hit me what had just happened. I had lost my mind. Suddenly a voice screamed in my head, "Do something, asshole!" I felt a wave of madness wash over me. I couldn't stop myself anymore. I moved to the other seat, found my driving gloves, and pulled them on. I deliberately got out of the car and quickly walked over to number 168. I put my left thumb on the peephole with my left hand and knocked twice with my right hand. When the door started to open and when John said, "What the hell, Craig?" my fist was already flying forward and hit John with all the anger and frustration I could muster. John's head snapped back, he backed up 2 steps and went down hard on his ass. He sat there in just his boxer briefs, closing his eyes and covering his face with his hands. I looked around the room, looking at the overturned bed and the ajar bathroom door. I could hear the shower running. I pulled up my pant leg and pulled my knife out of its sheath. His nose was mostly on the right side of his face. I tapped the handle of the knife on his nose to get his attention, then flipped the knife over when he opened his eyes. His eyes widened when he saw the tip of the knife in front of him. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" whispered I wildly. "Don't lie to me," I said coldly. Maybe 2 years. He stammered. Fear was evident in his voice and eyes. Then I suppose joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence, John? No, he said hoarsely, closing his eyes again in pain. I thought about that fact for a moment. He wanted to be near the man whose wife he was entertaining. You're just a sick bastard, John. Look at me, John. If I ever hear you approaching Sally or any other married woman, I'll find you. And I'll find your wart. Do you understand me? Understand? Repeated I when he hesitated. Yes, he wheezed at last. In fact, you'll be better off if you go far, far away. John's eyes bulged with horror. Suddenly, the stench of shit hit my nostrils, and I realized his guts had let go. At that moment, the shower noise stopped, and I heard the curtain being pulled back. Sally's voice came through the door. Hey, John boy. I thought you were going to get in the shower with me. What's up? And she giggled. I looked up just as the bathroom door opened, and Sally appeared in the opening. She was holding a towel and drying her hair when she suddenly saw me. Her eyes went wide. She gasped, her face pale to a pasty white. The towel fell to the floor and her mouth opened as she tried to say something. Complete shock was evident in every muscle. John boy doesn't seem well, I growled at her. I glared at her and took a step towards the bathroom. A look of panic appeared on her face as she took a step back and reached out with both hands to slam the door shut. I heard a click as she closed it. I turned and walked over to the nightstand next to the bed. Taking the phone, I cut the cord in one swipe of the knife and then slipped the knife back into its sheath. I turned around and headed for the front door. I stopped at the door and looked around the room once more. Suddenly, I screamed in frustration and misery, then picked up the phone and threw it with all my might right into the bathroom. It crashed violently into the door and fell to the floor, causing a terrified scream from inside. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I paused for a moment and realized that the job wasn't over yet. I walked over to another hotel room. Again, I put the thumb of my left hand to the peephole and knocked twice with my right hand. The door opened and Craig laughingly started to say, "You guys sure are noisy," when my fist flew under his chin. I heard a short shriek from the bed and looked over at Debbie, who was sitting at the headboard, her eyes like saucers and a sheet under her chin. I knelt over Craig and felt for his pulse. He was alive but faded like a light. I stood up and walked over to the nightstand next to the bed. Debbie let go of the sheet and pulled it down to her waist, covering her mouth with shaking hands, her frightened eyes looking at me through her fingers. I then picked up the phone receiver and with a quick jerk pulled the cord from the wall. Then I stepped back to the door and turned around to look at her. "If you tell your husband you ran into me tonight, tell him I said hi," I said sarcastically. Then, changing my mind, I said, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I tossed the phone into the corner of the room and walked out, closing the door behind me. I stood outside, looking up at the night sky and breathing in the cool air deeply. I could feel the tension fading away, replaced by a soothing tiredness. The do-something voice was gone. Everything was done. And I knew what else I needed to do. The only thing I could do. Purposefully, I headed to my car to start moving on with my life. "Yes?" Somewhat abruptly, I said into the phone. I was annoyed by this interruption, even though I had been expecting it all morning. I was immersed in thinking about Jason, Jesse, and Allie. They were the most important part of my life now. And figuring out how to shield them from the consequences of what had happened was my highest priority. "Phil, it's Jack." "Yeah, Jack?" I replied without enthusiasm. "What's going on in there?" "Sally was here at the house when her mom and I got home from church. She's crying and says she's afraid to go home." Jack said this forcefully, almost shouting. I looked at the clock. It was almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon, almost 14 hours since I had left Rochester Hills. "I don't know what I could have done to make her feel that way," I said. "She says you lashed out at a couple of Debbie's friends they ran into last night. Hurt them pretty badly." "Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't kill them," said I sarcastically. "Phil, what the hell? That's not like you." I thought for a moment about how to respond to that statement. In the end, I just asked my question. "Did Sally tell you where this fight took place?" "She said it was outside a restaurant in the Rochester Hills neighborhood." "So she was trying to get out of it. Well, her family, her history. Sally is your daughter, so I guess it must be true. I said slowly. There was silence on the phone, and I sensed Jack was trying to process all of this. Phil, I'm going to bring Sally home. I want to know what's going on. We need to talk. No problem, I wasn't going anywhere. Jack hung up abruptly, but not before I heard in the background, "No, Dad, no!" I sighed. She's not going to make this easy, I thought. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at old photos and mementos that were in my shoebox, and finishing my second beer when they pulled up. Jack walked into the kitchen, followed by Sally, who tugged on his arm. "Please, Dad, let us work this out. Phil and I need some alone time." I looked closely at Sally. She was makeupless, her hair loose, her eyes red and puffy. She was trembling as if she'd had a massive nervous seizure. She didn't return my gaze, holding onto her father's hand and trying to guide him back toward the door. But Jack wouldn't budge. Jack sat down in front of the kitchen table and stared at me. He looked at me and at the Ka-Bar knife lying on the table next to my beer in silence. Finally, he said, "Okay, Phil. What's going on?" I looked at Sally and said mockingly, "Yeah, Sally. Tell your daddy what's going on." She turned to me and said fiercely, "Shut up, Phil. You and I can work this out," her voice was commanding, but her eyes pleaded with me. I was infuriated that she thought things could be fixed if only we were alone, or that she thought like she could manipulate me. I was determined to be as honest as she was, lying. And she's the one who dragged her parents into this. I looked Jack straight in the eye. Turns out Sally and her boss Debbie have a couple of girlfriends they like to go out with when they're out of town. I found out about it and objected. Quite strongly, I must admit. I said it more tactfully than she deserved. Sally sighed, stepped back, and sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. Jack looked at me in disbelief. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that." "I don't believe you." Jack started to get angry with me and said, "That's enough, Phil. Now you're being cruel and disrespectful." I shifted my gaze from Sally to Jack and back to Sally again. I could feel the anger overcoming my feelings of hurt and sadness. "Cruel and disrespectful, you say?" "Not even close, Jack. I'll tell you what's cruel and disrespectful. You would have seen what I saw last night in her hotel room. Another man's footprints." I stated it in a voice devoid of emotion. Jack turned quickly to look at Sally. Judging by the frightened expression on Sally's face, it was obvious that I was telling the truth. Suddenly, Jack collapsed in his chair as if his spine could no longer support him. Jack's expression crumpled. He covered his face with his hands and whispered, "Oh, God." Sally turned pale, her eyes starting to water. "Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, Phil, can't we?" "Please, Phil, please," she pleaded. I sat in silence, rearranging old photos, going through souvenirs from an old shoebox, thinking back to a time when I was in incredible pain. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up and wiped his eyes. He looked at me expressionlessly. "What are you going to do, Phil?" he asked, watching the tears continue to flow down Sally's face. I sat and thought about this question for a few minutes. Finally, I said slowly, "I never told either of you about Vietnam or Ripcord." I sighed. "Hell, I never told anyone about Ripcord. Not even my therapist." I waved my hand at the pile of stuff on the table. "Isn't it ironic, Jack, that your generation displays its war memorabilia for all to see and admire, while my generation puts our reminders in a shoebox and hides it in the bottom drawer?" "Why is this so?" I asked rhetorically. I held up a faded photograph of two tanned, barefoot, skinny young guys in baggy jungle uniforms with badges around their necks. They grinned at the camera like Vietnam was a Boy Scout outing. Had I ever been so young? I certainly felt old now. I tossed the picture on the table between Jack and Sally and started talking like I was lecturing strangers. Jace and I were dropped off at Ripcord in May 1971. It was another base in a string of bases our battery was assigned to. We airlifted howitzers, set them up, conducted firing operations for a month or two to support the warriors making their way through the jungle, and then moved on to another base. We were in Vietnam for 6 months, and we had another 6 months before we had to rotate home. But this time it was different. We were stationed on a desolate ridge surrounded by the thickest and most forbidding jungle we had ever seen, overlooking the A Shau Valley near the Laos border. The valley was a bad place for the U.S. military. In previous years, it had been the site of several bloody battles with many casualties. The Ripcord Fire Support Base was intended to support 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne, which were battling in the mountains on either side of a Shao, trying to prevent the North Vietnamese army from penetrating the coast from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What a joke that was. The fire base consisted of our 155 gun battery, 1115 battery, a mortar platoon, and a company of support infantry to guard the perimeter. We had 2 helicopter landing pads and several ash and debris units, probably no more than 400 men at any one time. Virtually the entire fire base was underground, in bunkers, trenches, and tunnels. We learned later, near the end of the battle, that we were surrounded by about 12,000 North Vietnamese regular army soldiers. I looked sadly at Jack. Does that remind you of anything, Jack? Like your Marines at Chosin Reservoir? Jack nodded slowly and looked off into the distance, as if remembering another time and another place. I paused for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts and memories. The first 6 weeks or so weren't so bad, at least for us. But for those of us who were dropped off in combat formation on the hilltops around us, it was pure hell. We were almost constantly on missions to support them. Helicopters came and went from dawn to dusk. But we only occasionally took sniper fire or automatic weapons fire. But the helicopters, coming in for a landing, drew increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire. On the 1st of July, everything changed. Just after 7 a.m., we came under mortar fire for the first time. For the first week, the NVA fired an average of 20 to 30 shells daily at US from 60 and 81 millimeter mortars. Then they started firing large caliber mortars of 120 millimeters, large caliber guns that had never before been brought outside the demilitarized zone. The bad thing was that because of the wind blowing across the valley and the sounds of helicopters and retreating artillery, most of the time you couldn't hear the incoming artillery. That first week, I was caught off guard running from the mess hall to the fire control bunker when a mortar explosion knocked me off my feet. I jumped to my feet and made it to the FDC bunker in the least amount of time. As I slumped against the wall trying to catch my breath, Jace looked up from his desk and said nonchalantly, "Damn, Phil, you're bleeding." Of course, in my haste to get where I was going, I came out of the bunker without body armor. I never made that mistake again. The shrapnel hit me under my right shoulder blade. When I got to the infirmary, the surgeon took one look and decided to evacuate me safely to Camp Evans, our supply base, to have the shrapnel removed. An hour later, I was on my way. They extracted it with no problem, but decided I had a concussion and decided to keep me for a couple days for observation. By the time I got back to Ripcord, anyone who showed up from above had a more than equal chance of getting a shrapnel wound. The days went by and the shelling got heavier and heavier. Not only mortars, but rocket-propelled grenade launchers and recoilless guns. Toward the end, we were taking 70 to 80 shells a day. We began to suffer more and more losses. Our guns were in constant action. The muzzles of our howitzers were pointed almost straight upward as we fired at targets so close. The batteries used up their main charge in 3 or 4 hours. Heavy Chinook supply helicopters flew in with pallets of ammunition suspended from slings and fired 51 caliber NVA the entire way. They would detach without landing and take off with all the speed they were capable of. Then all who were not otherwise occupied would rush to the landing stage and start tossing shells and boxes of powder charges to the batteries. During one of these operations, I received another half-dozen minor shrapnel wounds. Between the constant shelling, doing our regular work, and bringing ammunition to the guns when there was nothing else to do, we were constantly exhausted. There were artillery planes, F-4 Phantom and even B-52S constantly around us conducting airstrikes on the hills. Smoke from shelling hung over the fire base and sometimes clouds of CS tear gas, which the NVA liked to throw at us, made the air stink. And after the 8th of July, when the Dinkies were first spotted in the wire, we were on alert almost every night. We all knew it was only a matter of time before the NVA would attempt a perimeter assault. We were all on edge, waiting for it to happen. As the shelling continued day after day, we began to take serious casualties. Morale was plummeting as we were left with the feeling that we had been abandoned here. Before it was over, we had lost over 500 killed and wounded. At least a dozen times I was assigned to carry body bags or stretchers to the helipad for evacuation. On the 18th of July, the worst thing that could happen happened. A Chinook airplane carrying a load of howitzer shells came under fire and crashed, right over a 115 battery and an ammunition supply point. The battery burst into flames like a Roman candle, Explosions and fires continued for several hours. All 6 guns were destroyed and several dozen men were wounded. We were all shocked. I looked at Jack, tears streaming down his face. When the Chinook went down, many of us rushed to the battery to try to help. Several of the injured suffered burns when the aviation gas ignited. Jace and I reached down to lift one machine gunner and put him on a stretcher when the skin on his arm, which I was holding, came off in the palm of my hand. I shook my head. "That and the smell of burning flesh I'll never forget," whispered I. Jack nodded at me with a grim expression, and Sally's face reflected horror. I took a deep breath and continued. We all knew this place wouldn't hold up, but the brass didn't see it. All they saw was an opportunity to hurt the enemy. After all, we had almost 4 NVA regiments gathered in one place, I said bitterly. A couple nights later, we were put on alert again. We were bombarded with automatic weapons all around the perimeter, as well as conventional fire. Jace and I had set up an M60 machine gun in a slot trench in front of the FDC bunker in case of a surprise attack. Our mortar platoon was constantly firing flares to illuminate the wire, and the infantry company was returning fire along the edge of the jungle. Every few minutes, artillery ships flew overhead and fired rockets or miniguns at suspicious NVA positions. Jace and I usually didn't try to return fire because there was a 3-man infantry position 20 to 30 yards in front of us, and return fire usually drew unwanted attention to our location. This night, the infantrymen were almost constantly popping up and firing M79 grenade launchers and automatic weapons toward the bushes. Every once in a while, tracer fire would return from the jungle. Then a volley of 20mm mortar rounds hit the infantry position in front of us. Jace and I ducked to the bottom of our foxhole as the ground shook. Stunned, we finally peered out from behind the edge of our position and saw that the infantry trench was completely covered. No one could crawl out of it. We quickly took up 60 positions, and Jace began returning fire while I fed him ammo from my belt. The platoon sergeant crawled over to us, and we told him what had happened to the infantry and that we would need more ammo. He nodded, ducked as low as he could, and rushed off toward the Tactical Operations Center. We were just reaching the last belt when suddenly I heard a shot from an M16 and felt as if my back and thighs had been hit with a baseball bat. I collapsed on the edge of the trench and stared into Jace's eyes. Unable to move, I saw in his eyes the realization of what had happened to him. He moved his lips, trying to speak, but nothing came out. I reached for his hand, he squeezed it once, and then I saw the light go out in his eyes, and I realized it was the end. I looked up at Jack and Sally, but I didn't see them. Tears were streaming down my face. My best friend in the world was dead, my brother, except in name. I felt alone, so alone, I said brokenly. I wiped my eyes and tried to pull myself together. I could hear Sally sniffling. Whether it was because of Jace or because of her own difficulties, I couldn't tell. Finally, I continued. I turned my head with difficulty to look behind me. About 10 feet in front of the FDC bunker, Corporal Tran was standing in front of us, pointing an M16 at us. Tran was one of Kit Carson's scouts assigned to the 101st Regiment. The scouts were mostly made up of North Vietnamese deserters who, for whatever reason, decided they were on the wrong side. Tran spoke English fairly well and sometimes acted as an interpreter when the infantry took prisoners or recovered documents from destroyed enemies. A couple times he took shelter in our bunker when we were shelled, and we ate together a few times. One night, Jace started teaching him how to play poker just for fun. Many of the scouts got clumsy when things got tense, if they thought there was a chance of being captured. They knew that in that case, all that awaited them was a bullet to the head. Most of them had been locked in one of the bunkers a few days ago as the siege continued and their behavior became increasingly suspicious. None of us trusted them. I don't know if Tran was just scared or if he was an NVA infiltrator. I guess it didn't really matter. Tran fired a whole clip at Jace and me. I took a couple of bullets in the back, but my body armor saved me from all but a couple of broken ribs and a severe concussion. One bullet hit the back of my thigh but didn't hit the bone. I felt myself starting to go into shock at the realization that Jace was really gone and I'd been shot. I fought unconsciousness as I knew that if I lost consciousness, I would probably die. I began to talk myself into getting angry, focusing on the enemy and getting even with him. As the anger built up, my vision took on a purple hue, and I could feel the murderous rage taking over my mind. Noticing my movement, Tran tried to shoot at me again. Luckily, he had already emptied his clip. I fell down and played dead. Tran must have decided he was done with me because he dropped his rifle and jumped over our trench. He started waving a flashlight and shouting in Vietnamese into the jungle on the other side of the wire. I struggled to get up on my knees to see what he was doing. A rocket-propelled grenade flew out of the bushes, narrowly missing him and me, leaving a distinctive corkscrew-shaped trail of smoke, and exploded behind us. He was jumping up and down, waving his flashlight around like a madman, almost foaming at the mouth. In the light of the flares, I saw 3 figures dressed in khakis and helmets separate from the edge of the jungle and run toward the wire. As they approached, I discerned the distinctive satchel charges hanging from their necks and the AK-50 carbines they held in their hands, indicating they were sappers. I tugged on the M60 that lay beneath Jace. I could barely stand on my feet, but I managed to pick it up and point it in their direction. I knew I had to stop them before they could punch a hole in the wire. I managed to fire 2 long bursts before the belt was empty. I don't know if I hit them, but the 3 sappers went down and Tran turned around and stared at me in shock. He screamed at me, saliva flying from his mouth, and he grabbed the machete hanging from his belt. Most scouts carried them with them to pick their way through the jungle on patrol. I just had time to put my foot on the edge of the trench and push off before Tran lunged at me. I dropped the M60 and managed to grab my knife from the sheath on my belt. We came face to face. Almost unconscious, I ended up on his chest as he tried to push me away and reach for the machete. He failed. I don't know how long I sat like that. With the flickering light of flares, the noise of exploding mortar shells, tracer shells flying overhead, the rumble of howitzers, the smell of cordite and burning debris in my nostrils, I felt like I was lost in hell. Suddenly, Eric, my platoon sergeant, pulled me by one arm and Lieutenant Dixon, our FDC officer, by the other. Dixon was yelling at me to get back to the bunker, that the fast movers were coming to rain napalm on our perimeter, and we were too close to the wire. I paused in my narrative, took a sip of beer, and ran the tip of my knife across the 3 Purple Heart medals lying on the table. In idleness, I arranged them in one sequence or another. Jack and Sally were silent, barely breathing. I could not look at either of them. Finally, I continued. It was about this time that I lost consciousness. I woke up in a medical bunker under in 4, with a battalion surgeon and one of the corpsmen working on me. Doc told me that I would probably survive and that they would fly me out in helicopters as soon as dawn came. I ended up being flown out around noon, which was a miracle. Every helicopter that came in was under heavy fire. 2 had already been shot down. The helicopter I was flying in received several shells, including one that killed the crew commander. But that morning, before I left, the decision was made to evacuate Ripcord. I found out later that they took everyone out on the 21st and then bombed the hell out of the place. I shrugged. It didn't matter to me anymore. 24 hours later, I was on a flight to a hospital in Japan. I spent a week there. Then I was transferred to Walter Reed for another month. While I was there, some colonel who had probably never heard of Ripcord went around handing out medals. They gave me this one for killing my enemies. I reached into the box, pulled out a piece of red, white, and blue silk with a silver star, and placed it on the table next to the purple hearts. It was identical to the one in the shadow box on Jack's mantelpiece. The doctors treated me well, and I'm told that after a couple months of rehab, I'll be fine. I shook my head, but I wasn't fine. At least not mentally. I was having nightmares every night and waking up screaming. I couldn't get the sounds, the smells, the faces of the dead and wounded out of my head. I missed Jace's funeral, but I managed to go home on vacation before heading to SIL base. The first thing I did was visit Jace's mom and dad. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. They wanted to know everything about Vietnam, what we did there, and how Jace died. But they didn't ask a single question. Why did I survive and he didn't? I paused and said quietly, "It's the same question I asked myself almost every day." I stared into space, reflecting on this dark time in my life. I was in therapy, but I still felt like I was withdrawing from the world. I didn't want to see anyone or talk to anyone. I did the bare minimum of what I had to do at Fort Sill to keep everyone happy. I immersed myself in college drafting classes, so I wouldn't have to socialize with the other guys after work. When it was time to get out of the Army, I moved back in with my parents and continued going to school. Not because I really cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. I lifted my head and looked into Sally's eyes, and all the pain, resentment, and anguish of the previous night almost blinded me. "And then I met Sally," whispered I. She suppressed a sob, lowered her gaze to the table, and refused to look at me. You brought me back to the real world. You were happy and totally interested in everyone and everything around you, and you were beautiful, inside and out. All the things I thought I wasn't. And you made me want to get to know you. You made me want to truly live again and gave me a glimpse of what my life could be. And I fell in love with you. You saved me. And you gave me 3 wonderful children. For that, I will always be grateful to you, I said wistfully. For a few minutes, we sat there without moving. Finally, Jack cleared his throat and said quietly, "What now, Phil?" I turned my head tiredly and looked at him. "Jack, I've been betrayed twice in my life. Both times I lost my best friend," I said simply. Sally lowered her face into her hands and began to sob, whispering, "No, no, no." All 3 of us sat in silence, Sally sobbing and Jack and I had tears in our eyes. Jack said quietly, "Are you sure, Phil? You want to throw it all away because of one mistake?" Sally raised her head, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes. I knew that what I had to say would put a stake in our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie go. I shook my head and looked at him. "The only mistake, Jack?" "It wasn't the only mistake. I found out last night that Sally had been cheating on me for almost 2 years. And it wasn't with just one man." Sally sighed, closed her eyes, shook her head in despair, and sank into her chair even paler than she had been before. I looked at her curiously. "John didn't tell you, Sally? That he confessed to everything?" I turned to Jack. "Does that answer your question?" I said. Jack slowly stood up and looked sadly at Sally. "You are my daughter, and I should love you. But I have lost all respect for you. Your behavior—" Jack stopped, unable to find the words, and just shook his head. Sally reached out to him, wanting to touch him, but he pulled away. He turned to me and said firmly, "Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do. But please don't hurt her." I couldn't sit still for that. "No, Jack, I'm past that," I said sadly. "But if it makes you feel better, take this with you." I slipped the knife back into its sheath and held it out to him. Jack silently accepted it and turned toward the door. His shoulders were slumped, and he was no doubt contemplating how he should tell Emily. As soon as the door closed behind him, the phone rang, but neither of us even looked at it. We just sat there, not moving, not talking, and not looking at each other. The ringing finally stopped, and the silence became even more deafening. Finally, I said, looking into space, "I expected the cops to come to you this morning, not your father." Sally flinched at this and, stumbling, said, "Debbie and I convinced them to make up a story about being attacked outside the bar. We hoped that if they kept quiet, you wouldn't call their wives." I thought for a moment and realized I was free. Now there was no way they could change their story to be believed. For a second, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, until I remembered that everything around me was falling apart. I just hummed and asked, "So where are they now?" Sally cleared her throat and fidgeted in her chair. "They're still in the hospital under observation. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, a couple broken teeth, and a concussion." I said bluntly, "Don't forget their balls, Sally." Sally looked at me with fear and trepidation in her eyes. No, you did some serious damage to them." She hesitated for a moment. "I never knew you were so cruel, Phil." "Did you have to do that?" I looked at her in bewilderment. "You're defending those bastards?" I said sarcastically. Before she could answer, the phone rang again. "You should answer it. It's probably for you," I said, and got up and went to the bathroom. I washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I looked just like I felt, old and haggard, at least older than my years. It had been an almost sleepless night. I went back into the kitchen. Sally was just standing there, staring at the phone in her hand. Slowly, she hung up the phone and slumped down on one of the kitchen chairs. When I sat back down, she said without looking at me, "You had to, too? Did you have to tell Debbie's husband?" I shrugged and replied, "Why shouldn't I share his pain? He's already called John and Craig's wives. And he kicked Debbie out of the house. She's going to have to hire a lawyer to see her own daughter." She started crying again and mumbled, "Shit, shit, shit!" She looked up at me and said with tears streaming down her face, "And she fired me. She said it was all my fault." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's just wonderful. Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it? In between sniffles, Sally asked, How did you know? You know, when I told Josh this morning what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't want to believe me. Called me a liar and accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But as soon as I said John Harrison's name, he changed his mind. He turned pale as a ghost and started swearing like a sailor. It must have been the first time in his life he ever got angry. You told me years ago that this was Debbie's second marriage, and she was estranged from her parents. It seems Debbie has a sister living upstate that she never sees either. About a year ago, Josh was auditing a company, and one of the people he worked with turned out to be Sarah, Debbie's sister. Sarah knew Debbie had remarried, and Josh knew Debbie had a sister, but they had never met. Anyway, they hit it off, and one night, before he finished his audit, Sarah invited him to have dinner with her and Dave, her husband. She had a story to tell. It turned out that her husband Dave was Debbie's first husband. Dave and Debbie started dating in college. They dated for 2 years until Debbie graduated from college and then got married. Around their wedding anniversary, Dave found out that Debbie was having an affair. He also found out that Debbie had cheated on him throughout their relationship. He kicked her out and filed for divorce. Debbie and her parents fought over this as well. Dave and Sarah then started dating and eventually got married. They now have a couple kids and seem very happy. Of course, Debbie never told Josh about all of this. And guess who Debbie had an affair with during her first marriage? Surprise. It was John Harrison. I stopped and Sally just stared at me in shock. Oh yeah, and when I mentioned John's name, Josh started putting the pieces together and realized that Debbie had been doing the same thing to him that you did to me throughout their marriage. No wonder he threw her out on the street. And I, like Josh, am wondering how long you've been messing around with me, I stated firmly. Sally cried again and said, Oh my God, Phil, it was only John and Craig, and only during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I never ever even thought about anyone else until Debbie brought it up before our first shopping trip. She sat twirling her handkerchief in her fingers, alternately crying and begging. Please, Phil, I don't know how I got where I am now. It was like I woke up from a dream, or maybe a nightmare, when I opened the bathroom door and saw you standing there. I didn't say anything, just looked at her grimly. Encouraged, she began to speak quickly, almost babbling. I knew Debbie liked to play before we even started shopping. She talked about it like it was the most fun she'd ever had in her marriage. But I didn't expect her to hook up with anyone during our trip. I was totally surprised when John showed up at the restaurant and Debbie introduced him to me. She explained that she had known John since high school and that he just happened to be in the neighborhood. I suspected that wasn't true, but I didn't say anything. She paused, bit her lip, and looked away. John was at his best that night. Flirted, danced with both of us, paid me a lot of compliments. I had a couple more drinks than I was used to, and when his hands got a little loose on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, when we got back to the hotel, Debbie went with John. He had booked the room next to ours. I realized that Debbie had set the whole thing up. The hotel we were in was old, with thin walls. I could hear them doing it most of the night. I guess that explains why you were like that when you came home that Sunday, didn't it? Said I with disgust. Sally hung her head and nodded. She wiped her eyes and continued. The next morning, John was gone. We had breakfast and Debbie told me in detail about their night together. She raved about him all the way home. Over the next few months, Debbie and I had lunch together at work a couple times a week as usual. She often mentioned John and how much fun she had with him. That's when I first heard about his wart. Debbie laughingly told me that I should try it one day because she couldn't explain it. At first, I just laughed at her. But the more she talked about it, the more the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, when another opportunity to go shopping presented itself, Debbie confessed that John really wanted to be with me, and she was fine with it if I wanted to be with him. I kind of laughed at that, but asked her what she would do if I did that. She said John had a friend Craig who would come over and keep her company. I didn't say no, and I don't know why. I told her I would think about it, but I don't think I could do it. Sally looked at me and I just stared back at her expressionlessly. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but the thought crossed my mind that I could do it and no one would know. Sally looked away again and said, That Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner and a few drinks and then went to a nightclub. We split into couples and I was with John. I had had enough to drink by then, and convinced myself that nothing bad would come of it. Everyone was having a great time. Later, when we got back to the motel, John and I naturally went to our room and Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally fell silent and just stared at her hands. Finally, I said dismissively, "So, was it as you thought it would be?" Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. "It was okay. It wasn't any better than what you and I have. What made it so hot was that it was so wrong and it was with someone new and I could pretend to be someone else." "You mean it wasn't just okay? He turned you on so much that you forgot about your husband who was waiting for you at home. Your husband who took care of your kids out of love for you so you could be alone," I said bitterly. Sally suppressed a sob and turned away again. "Yes," she whispered. "And how do you explain Craig, my spouse?" said I sarcastically. Without looking at me, she replied, "After we slept with John a few times, Debbie joked that she was starting to miss him. I didn't think too much about it, but on the next trip when we got separated into couples, I danced with Craig almost all night. Later at the motel, Craig came to my room and he and I spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then, a couple trips later, John and Craig switched in the middle of the night. I didn't realize it at first until I woke up late one night and realized that the man making love to me wasn't the man I started out with." Sally looked at me sadly. "I felt like I was two different people living in two different worlds. I like our life together, you and me and the kids. But I got hooked on these weekends. I thought I could have both and you would never know. How stupid could I have been?" "Damn stupid," I agreed. "And then when you saw me at the motel, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized what I'd become." She whispered almost to herself. I stood up and looked down at her. "Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending. Or maybe there is, for you. I'm going to go get the kids. Tonight, when Allie is asleep, you and I will sit with Jason and Jesse and tell them that their parents will be living apart. I think Allie is too young to understand. We won't tell them the real reason. And I'll do my best to minimize the trauma for them. I'll sleep on the couch in the basement until I make other arrangements." Sally shouted after me as I started to walk away. "Phil, my God, this was a mistake!" "I love you. Don't do this, please." I turned and said, "Why not?" Sally, sobbing uncontrollably, replied, "It was only 3 or 4 nights a year. I never saw John or Craig or anyone outside of that weekend. Please, Phil, I'm begging you. Can't you forgive me and let me make things right?" "Forgive you, Sally? Forgive you for becoming a whore for other men 3 or 4 nights a year? For giving away the thing you cherished most in the world, yourself? Forgive me for destroying my trust in you? Forgive me for destroying my belief that you and I belong to each other and no one else?" I said sadly. "And how would you fix that? Could you go back in time and start over? Can you not have fun with John this time? And not have fun with Craig? Because that's what it takes to make things right," said I tiredly. I stood silently, looking around the kitchen, the family photos on the wall, the kids' drawings and newspapers on the fridge, Allie's baby chair in the corner, all the things that made this house a home. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I spent most of last night without sleep, asking myself how I'll feel about you in 6 months, a year from now, or 5 years from now. I'm sure I'll be able to forgive you someday, but what I won't be able to do is forget. Not in a year, not in 5 years, not even in 10. Every time I see you, I will think of last night. Every time I hear your voice, I will think of last night. And every time I hear your name, I will remember last night." I said this with a hitch in my voice. With tears in my eyes, I said, "That's what, Sally, I can't live with." I stood there, unmoving, sadly contemplating the future, barely noticing Sally, who was rocking back and forth in her chair, alternately sobbing and crying, "No, please, God, no!" After a few minutes, I said softly, "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked at me with empty eyes, like a condemned prisoner who knows there will be no commutation of sentence. You lost the man who loved you more than anything in the world. You lost the respect of your parents, the respect of my parents, and the respect of your husband. You've lost your job. And someday you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it? After a moment of silence, broken only by Sally's muffled sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.